over to you.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and share my screen, so let me know if you can see it now.
Yes, indeed.
Can everyone see that?
Excellent.
So I was asked to just give a broad overview of a bit of butterfly biology and also a bit of a focus on why butterflies have the wing patterns they have, which we all love, and that's the reason why we can identify many of them. So some of this will be new to some and a lot will be old stuff, but just a general talk for a bit of inspiration. So what we're going to look at today is I'm going to talk a bit about the ecological reason why we do have these different wing patterns. And I'm going to go through a little bit from an African perspective about names, number, and life cycles of butterflies. And then a bit of boring stuff, perhaps, the anatomy of butterflies, because once you try and look and identify things, it helps if you know a little bit about what to look for. And then I'm going to introduce very briefly the 5 families of butterflies. In reality, there are 6, but there's very, very few in one of them, so we skip that one. And then I'm also going to introduce a new resource I'm working on, a new type of field guide, which is soon going to be available from a West African and mainly Nigerian perspective. So if we start just looking at butterfly wings, the butterfly wing is a very thin thing. It's formed of just 2 layers of chitin that are supported by these wing veins, and then it's generally covered by overlapping scales. And if you look at this butterfly, this one is a South African butterfly, the one in the picture, you can see that when there is no scales, you can actually see straight through the wing. And the scales themselves are monochromatic, which means that they have just a single color per scale. And they get their colors either through interference of light, which is basically when the light is reflected back in certain ways, or through colored pigments. And this is a quite classic picture that was made by a Norwegian photographer who tried to find the whole alphabet and all numbers in butterfly and moth wings, but it's just to show you the enormous diversity we do have in terms of patterns. But if we look a little bit more in detail, I'm sorry, this example is a European butterfly, the peacock butterfly. If we start and look at a scanning electron microscope to see how butterfly wing really looks, you will notice that you get these kind of scales that looks almost like roof tiles on a tile roof. And if we move in a bit closer, you can see that the scales have textures. If we move even closer, you can see there's even more hidden in the details. And at this level, you can see that these are incredibly intricate structures. And sometimes these structures are so fine that they themselves can break wavelengths of light beams to get the colors we are seeing. And here's an example a bit more out where you can see normal colors. You can see that each of these scales only carry a single color, and it's the combination of these, almost like pixels on a screen, that makes the color we see. But then why do butterflies have patterns? Because everyone who's out looking at butterflies can't stop being amazed by often the beauty of these patterns. So why on earth, what do the butterflies use these patterns for? And the sad thing is, well, sad, but the main thing is that almost all of these patterns are actually camouflage. And a lot of times you might not even see the animals because they're hidden so well. So the butterfly to the left is again a butterfly which you won't find in Africa, but you can see that it's camouflaged almost like a leaf on the color, and the outline is broken up, as you can see here, to kind of look it's very hard for a predator to find that one. And on the right image is also a butterfly, and those among you who know what to look for might already have seen it. But if not, we can move a little bit closer. And even closer, you can see this butterfly camouflaged just like a leaf sitting on the ground. And here's another example of cryptic color. The problem is when you have cryptic camouflage, you also have to decide where to sit. So in this case, it's the same species of butterfly photographed within a few meters from each other in Nigeria. And you can see that the one on the left is quite hard to find, but if you then sit on the wrong type of background, your cover is quickly blown. So it's very important to combine this camouflage with a behavior that makes you invisible. There's another common thing found on butterflies, and it's these kind of startling, often eye-like markings. And these are used to avoid attacks, not necessarily by lasting as a very long signal. It's what happens is these butterflies are often sitting with their wings folded, and if a predator comes close, they will quickly fan the wings out and expose these totally different patterns. And that tiny bit of startling effect that has on the predator, sometimes we're talking just about milliseconds, can be enough for the butterfly to start to escape before the predator realizes that, wait, this is just the same butterfly that I tried to attack. So these eye spots work by just giving them a tiny bit more time to escape. And then you commonly find another type of spots on butterflies, often on a group of butterflies called satyrids and browns. And if you look at these, you often find eye spots at the edge of the wings, but they are sitting in a way that you can see them all the time. And these eye spot works in a different way. They're not there to scare a predator. They're actually there to divert the attack. And it's been shown in laboratory experiments that predators such as mantises, who are big predators on butterflies, they target these eye spots because they believe it's the head of the butterfly. And this edge of the butterfly wing, they can manage to survive without. So it's basically a way to deflect an attack away from parts of the animal that they can manage without. And another example of these kind of deflective patterns is found in a lot of other types of butterflies called blues or lycenids. And here, if you look at the end of the wing, you can see these long tails, often combined with these eye-like spots, that forms a false head illusion. So when this butterfly lands, this looks like the head of something. And if a predator was following them, they're more likely to attack the end of the butterfly. And once again, they're fine to live without this. So these type of deflection system gives them a chance to survive at least one attack from a predator. Then we have another thing you can do. You can use these patterns to signal to predators that you're poisonous. And that's right, a lot of butterflies are poisonous, usually from plants that the larvae feed on that contains poisons. And there's two different ways this works. So one is this thing we call Müllerian or honest mimicry, where several butterflies that are poisonous have similar patterns, so that predators quicker learn that this pattern is linked to something you should not eat. But then you get another type of mimicry, which is called Batesian mimicry or dishonest mimicry. And in this case, what happens is that other butterfly species who are not poisonous, so would be perfectly good to eat, they also mimic this pattern to get protection because the predators still think that it's best to avoid these. So if you look at the butterfly in the top left corner, that one is perfectly edible, but it looks very similar to the one below it, which is a different species that is highly poisonous. And in this case, the butterfly at the top is a very common butterfly all over Africa that has many different morphs within the same species. So the one to the top right is the same as the one to the left. And both of these forms mimic different poisonous butterflies. So all over Africa, this butterfly comes in several shapes, and they all mimic things that are not good to eat. And another reason for differences in butterflies in color patterns is sexual selection, which you more used to seeing in things like bird, that male birds often have very colorful patterns to attract females. And the same is true in many insects. So when you get very big differences in the looks of males and females, it's usually because the female pattern has another function than the males. And in those cases, the male pattern is usually there to attract a mate. And finally, one thing that is very special with butterflies is how having these flat wings that they can decide whether they have closed or open enables them to carry two types of signals in the same animal. So if you look at this example, it's the same butterfly species, either with the wings closed or open, which means that they get a benefit of having two different signaling systems in the same animal. So over and back to a bit of basic butterfly names and stuff. So you saw that butterflies have scales on their wings, and that's where they got their names. So Lepidoptera, which is the name for butterflies and moths in Latin, means literally scale wing. But we said moths before. Most Lepidoptera are moths. So if you look at it, we have 180,000 species of Lepidoptera described so far in the world. And this represents about 10% of all known animals. So it's already clear how much more important these guys are than birds. Skip the birds, go for butterflies. But among these, 90% are moths. So butterflies themselves is in a way almost like a day-flying moth. They're a little subgroup of a larger group of moths. And in Africa, there is about 4,000 species of butterflies. And in West Africa, which is my own focus, there is about 1,500 species of butterflies. To put that in context, in UK, where I'm talking now, we're talking about 50, 60 species. So there's an enormous difference. And butterflies, all butterflies start their life as an egg. And from the egg, a small larvae hatch. And these larvae go through several sets of instars, which means that they will change their skin completely 4 or 5 times while they develop. And for each time they grow bigger. And most of the butterflies are feeding on plants. So they're herbivores, grazing animals. But there are also examples of butterfly larvae, for example, are carnivores. And what often happens is ants often have a relationship with butterfly larvae, especially in the family called Lycaenids, the blues. And in many cases, this is not a relationship that benefits the ants. So if you look at the larvae down at the right of that last picture down here, this larvae has been found by ants. And it uses chemical communication that fools the ants. So the ants think that this is an ant larvae and they take it down in their nest. And in the nest, the ant larvae are eaten by the butterfly larvae without the ants stopping it, because they still are sure that this is just one of our own. So they are parasites in ant nests, and then they will pupate down there and crawl out as an adult butterfly without the ants harming it. But regardless of what they feed, after a few instars, they will turn into a pupae. And in the pupae, there are big changes happening. So this was previously just a larvae without any wings. You can see in the pupae here how the wings have started to form. And then the butterfly emerges from the pupae as a winged adult that can fly. And this adult life stage is usually quite short because the main purpose of this stage is breeding. So most adult butterfly are focused on just a little bit of feeding to sustain themselves, but most of their focus is to finding a mate and lay eggs. And if we look at how these adult butterflies are formed, this is an example of a skipper. Just like all other insects, you will find the 3 main body parts, the head and the thorax and the abdomen. And obviously hind wing, we have 4 wings and then lots of different parts of the legs and the antenna. Don't worry too much about the details, but it's good if you get serious into butterfly biology to start familiarize yourself with these, because sometimes the differences described between species is not found on the wings. It might be such tiny things as the color of the hair of the hind leg or something like that. So it's good to gradually get to study the butterflies beyond just the wings. And all these butterflies also have a quite specialized mouth part. So what you're seeing in these photos is a high resolution photo or high magnification photo of the proboscis, the trunk of the butterfly, which is formed of 2 very thin, long sheets that are lying next to each other. And with the help of capillary forces, they can drag up liquid food with this. So all butterflies feed on various liquid substances if they feed at all. Some don't feed at adults. The other thing that is good to learn, but don't worry about all the names you're going to see here, because this is a little bit more than is necessary for this level. But what is important to understand is that when you look at birds, for example, you used to hear talks about wing covers, you talk about different parts of the beak. We have different ways to describe to each other where the patterns of a bird is, so that we can write a guide and describe how to study them. And with butterfly wings, you also have different ways to do this. So you have different ways of describing the edges of the wings, and you talk about the edges as well. There's the margins and the edges, the same for the hind wing. And then each of these wing veins can be named and numbered in different ways, and also all the spaces in between. And this takes a while to get used to, but when you start reading more advanced literature of butterflies to learn to identify them, you might see something like the forewing has a big spot in cell 3, which is a little bit better than to say the forewing has a spot a little bit up somewhere in the middle. So we're learning how to kind of describe in detail difference between species, and the same on both wings. And then we also talk about the different regions more depending on if it's close to the body or not. But this is something that will come later if you seriously get into study butterflies, to start learning these areas. It's not that necessary at an early stage. But what about moths? How do you separate a butterfly from a moth? And it's not always that easy, because many moths do fly at day and look very similar to butterflies. But in general, the safest thing to do is to look at the antennae. And if you look at the antennae of a butterfly to the left, they usually have this clubbed end. It ends in a little club. While in moths, it's quite frequently a thin end, but often with some feathering. But whether they have this feather-like, almost like a radar-looking thing, depends on if it's a male or a female moth. So the moth you see to the right is a male moth, and they have these antennae to smell with, and they can smell females from a very, very long distance. We're talking about several kilometers sometimes on a still night. So the moths, male, have these feathered antennae, while the female moths have much thinner antennae. But if you look in detail, you can see that there is no club at the end. And the main families of butterflies, there is a good starting point if you're interested in butterfly observations to learn, is first of all you have the papilionid, that's the Latin names, they're often called swallowtails and swordtails. And these are very large butterfly, and often with very long spindly legs. And they sometimes have these long tails at the end. And when you see them, they're very good flyers that often glide or can hang on an upwind close to hilltops. So these are quite easy to get to learn after a while. Then you have a special little group called Hesperids, or skippers. These are usually quite small. Some of them can be large, but in general quite small ones. And they are actually, in Swedish, we call them thickheads. Because if you look at them, they have very large heads compared to the rest of the body. They look almost like a little moth. And they have these very strong flight muscles in the body. And they often hold their wings in a specific position, that the hind wing is down and the forewings are halfway up, like this one to the side, but sometimes flat and sometimes held together. And when they fly, they have a very fast buzzing flight. So if you don't know what to look for, many people think that a skipper who passes them is actually a big fly. Another group is the Pierids, or the whites and sulfurs. These are small to medium-sized butterflies, and generally, but not always, the ground color of the wings is a quite light white or yellow. And the pattern is often formed by black spots, but sometimes with these red and yellow patterns as well. And many of these butterflies are highly migratory. So yes, just like birds, they will move and migrate. Some of them very long distances, but the majority of African butterflies, just like many birds, will migrate with the rain patterns. So during the dry season, many butterflies that have been breeding in areas that are drying out, they're moving to try and find lush vegetation for their larvae throughout the year. And that means that at any given time of the year, you will have different species in different regions. Then we have the Lycaenids, which is the blues, the coppers and hair streaks. This is a very diverse group and quite hard to describe, but they generally have some sort of metallic colors. They're not always blue like this in the picture. They can be reddish, copper colored, sometimes almost bronze. And ventrally, the patterns are often made up of either these spots or combination of streaks that sometimes merge into bands. And they very often have either long or very small tails at the hindwings. And a lot of these butterflies in Africa have complex relationship with ants, just as we saw before. Some of them feed on ant larvae, others are actually producing sweet things that the ants like to gain protection from the ants. But you will probably think, probably about half of the butterflies, the Lycaenis in Africa, have some sort of link directly to ants, which means that protect them, we need to protect both the butterflies and the ants. And the final group I'm going to talk about is the nymphalids, or the brush-footed butterflies. This is a very diverse, large group. They're medium-sized to large butterflies. And if you look up very close, you can't see it in this picture, but if you look up close, they have the first pair of legs is highly reduced. So often you think like they only have 4 legs, but in reality, the first pair of legs is kind of hiding away close to the head. And these look very diverse. It's very hard to describe them, and they're often strong flyers and quite easy butterflies to learn to identify because they're big and often show off their patterns. So how do you then get around to learn to identify them? And for West Africa, there is a very, very good book, which was written by Torben Larsen in 2005 after 20 years of research. This is still the absolute Bible for anyone interested in West African butterflies. But the problem with this book is that it is very expensive. We're talking about $250, $300 US, and it's also out of print, which means that it's very hard to get hold of these days. But even if it is a quite scientific and very detailed book, Torben has a skill of writing, so it's quite easy as an amateur to understand what he means. So this is the best resource. But because this is hard to find, what I did is a few months ago, I produced a guide that was specifically aimed for a place in Nigeria for the students that work there at the Flora Institute. And this guide contains details of about 140 species. And this one is available for free, not at the moment, but in a few days, it's going to be on my webpage, and I will give you details later. But what I also started to do is to adapt this guide in the form of an app for phones. It's more of an ebook that's going to work on both iPhones and Android phones. And initially I planned to remake this guide that I already had for Amarum in Nigeria, but I decided it's better to try and make a very basic guide of a few common species for West African setting. And I'm doing this mainly because there's such a drive in Nigeria right now. And the idea here, you can see a screenshot how the guide works. You can swipe between species. You can click links to get to different species. There will be photos available. And for some species, you can see that there is more pointers and identifications. And for tricky groups, you can scroll down for more detailed identification guides. And the aim is basically to gradually develop this one to contain a few hundred species, but it's an ongoing project, so you will have to hold on a little bit of time. And this guide will be available from my webpage. And the webpage, the address is www.bicyclus.se. The name comes from the fact that Bicyclus is my favorite butterfly genre. Most people call them brown and boring, but they're the coolest butterflies in Africa. And if you look at the top of the page, you can see these links. And if you click at the one at resources, you will in a few days be able to download these things. And I will initially put up the already ready-made guide for the forest reserve to look at. And then I'm asking if people can contact me who work in Nigeria ideally, but you're okay from other places as well. But I would like to get hold of about 10 people to begin with. Because the point is, I would like to field test on various phones that these guides work, so we don't have a lot of bugs that we can solve first. And as soon as we know that this seems to work on various models of phones and is practically usable, then the goal is that this is going to be available fully for free, and anyone who signs up and sends their email to this and download the guides will get a regular email when there is updates, and also if there is ideas on changes, so it's all can be found there and work that way. And that's about it for my presentation. So I'm going to hand over to the next speaker.
Great. Many thanks, Oskar. Fascinating overview of butterflies. Wow, very interesting and some stunning images there. Thank you very much indeed. And what a wonderful resource that you've put together, and we look forward to seeing that that very special resource growing. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. I think if there are questions